Good morning, everyone, and could I just add my Céad Míle Fáilte to those of you who've come from outside Ireland, from about 40 countries, I understand, for this great gathering. And it started so well. I can't remember when I was last at a conference like this that began with the choir singing. It should happen more often. Thank you very much indeed for this. And thank you, Anastasia, for your warm words and indeed for your very thoughtful opening words as chairperson. I'd also like to thank the three organisations who've come together, Community Work Ireland, the International Association for Community Development and the Department of Applied Social Studies here at Maynooth University for the invitation to speak. And I'd like to congratulate the International Association for Community Development on your 65th birthday. And I understand there will be a cake later, I'm told. I'm really very happy to be here among community development practitioners and to see so many countries and communities represented. Looking at the experience in the room, I have no doubt that your many topics will ensure a good deal of what is important, listening to and learning from each other, sharing experience from each other. And when I looked at the conference themes that you'll discuss, I was very aware that they resonated so well with me because community development and climate justice are very closely aligned. And I can see several of the principles of climate justice which have been adopted by my foundation across the conference themes. Principles such as respect and protect human rights, support the right to development, ensure that decisions on climate change are participatory, transparent and accountable, and of course, highlight gender equality and equity. I have to say that I came to climate change not as a scientist or even as an environmental lawyer, and I wasn't really very impressed by the images of polar bears and melting glaciers. It was because of the impact on people and the impact on their rights to food and safe water, health, education and shelter. And I say this with humility because I came quite late to the issue of climate change. When I served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, climate change wasn't at the front of my mind. I don't remember making any significant speech on climate change. I knew that there was another part of the UN Convention on Climate Change, that was dealing with the issues of climate change. I suppose we were in our silos, as so often happens in large organisations. It was later, when I started to work in African countries on issues of development and human rights, and I just kept hearing over and over this phrase, things are so much worse now, things are so much worse. And when I explored what was behind that, it was about the unpredictability of the weather, and the fact that farmers didn't know when to sow, didn't know whether their harvest would last because there might be floods or there might be extreme drought. Many of them said to me, we thought God was punishing us. No idea what was causing this, and yet it was so severe. As it happens, I was in Malawi about 2 weeks ago. Anyone here from Malawi? Don't see any hand going up. But anyway, I had the pleasure of visiting a community and seeing projects supported by Irish Aid in partnership with Trócaire, United Purpose and the Catholic Development Commission of Malawi. I visited a village in Kanyera in Dedza district where I met Lucretia Fimlimoni, a mother of 7, and she explained to me that the changing weather patterns associated with climate change mean that in recent years she has struggled to grow enough food to feed her family and to earn money to send her children to school and to meet their family's basic needs. Lucretia lives in a village that has no access to electricity. I asked if anybody had a solar panel. No one in the village. She doesn't have a car. In fact, she has none of the benefits that many of us here in this room have as a result of fossil fuels. Lucretia and her community are those who are the most impacted, though least responsible for the impacts of climate change. And this is the injustice of climate change. Those who are most vulnerable in society, no matter the level of development of the country in question, will suffer most. This means that people who are marginalised or poor, women, indigenous communities, slum dwellers and migrants will be disproportionately affected by climate impacts. It's a terrible injustice and why I continue the fight for climate justice. Climate justice can be explained by saying that it links human rights and development to achieve a human-centred approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable people and sharing the burdens and the benefits of climate change and its impacts equitably and fairly. I came to climate justice because, for me, it embodies both parts of a moral argument to act on climate change. Being on the side of those who are suffering most, while also ensuring that they don't suffer further as the world takes action on climate change, and that they share the benefits of a world powered by renewable energy. Climate justice transforms climate change from a discussion on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate change impacts at its very heart. And as you'll be aware, the 2030 Agenda envisages, and I quote, "a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality and non-discrimination, of respect for race, ethnicity and cultural diversity, and of equal opportunity, permitting the full realisation of human potential and contributing to shared prosperity." End quote. This is the world that we can create, building on what we've achieved to date and being determined to forge a bright future for generations to come. Justice, dignity and the rule of law are foundational values that can shape a resilient world, able to withstand shocks and able to withstand outbreaks of violence, able to protect citizens and to uphold rights. Agenda 2030 draws the links between climate change and sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals are universal, as you know, and apply to all countries. However, we cannot have peaceful and prosperous societies without taking urgent action on climate change. I was very happy to see the theme of the conference is, and I quote, "Participation, Power and Progress, Community Development towards 2030, our analysis, our actions." The right to participation is one of the principles of climate justice, and it's something that my foundation has been working on for the past 8 years, and we feel very strongly about it. However, I don't think I'm alone in that view in the room here today when I say I think of community development work, and those of you involved in it, we think of words like inclusion, participation, and people-centred. It seems obvious to us here in the room that ensuring the meaningful participation of people in decision-making processes that impact their lives, that there is a gender dimension, a gender balance, and that women have a voice in these processes that will lead to more robust and more impactful decisions on any topic. But it's not, it seems, obvious to everyone. And we constantly need to remind others that there's a value in diversity and a value in listening to and also including local voices and traditional knowledge. I recall learning an important lesson which has stayed with me. It was during a conference that my foundation joined with the Irish government to organise in 2013, entitled Hunger, Nutrition, Climate Justice. Ireland at the time had the presidency of the EU, so there were ministers from other EU countries and the EU Commission, as well as experts such as Al Gore at the conference. But the real value was that of the 300 participants, 100 were from grassroots and indigenous communities worldwide. And most of the discussions took part in learning circles, all sitting in equal terms in a circle and feeling equal in their participation. And I recall Etrida Luanga, a community member from Malawi, saying, "You have to listen to me because I have experience. What I know isn't written in your notes." And, it was an important statement, and she said it with confidence because she felt she really was participating on equal terms. And I've benefited greatly from listening to frontline experts on climate change, such as Etrida. I saw the value of this type of participation during my recent visit to Malawi. With the support of Irish Aid and partners, Lucretia and her community have undertaken a number of interventions to address the development needs in light of climate impacts. And these included building irrigation systems, water management, improving the watershed management and having a borehole in different places in the village, and making changes to their crop production techniques by diversifying, because maize is not a good drought crop and they suffer greatly from drought in that area. And the hard work is paying off, and as a community they're coping better with the uncertainties of the weather and the growing season, as well as more extreme weather events. And what was central to this success was the community's ownership of the interventions. Every project was described by 2 or 3 members from the community with a very good gender balance, and they owned the process entirely. It was theirs, it was their development, and that was what really impressed me. I had the pleasure of a lunch with women only, about 12 women from the community, and from the discussion it was obvious to me that the success of the projects in the community was in no small part from the community ownership of the activities and the manner in which they had been designed, taking on board the community's experience and their local knowledge. You may recall that in her acceptance speech for the Sydney Peace Prize, author and activist Arundhati Roy said something that resonates with me. She said, "We know, of course, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." To many, this can be a confronting statement, but it's true nonetheless. We who are in positions of decision-making power, or who engage in processes that will ultimately affect the lives and decide the fate of whole swathes of the planet's people, cannot do so in isolation. We have a moral imperative to ensure that no one is preferably unheard. I would argue this needs to be at all levels, not just the community, where we're much better at doing that, but at all levels of decision-making, from local to national to international levels. It's easy to argue that at the international level, negotiating highly technical aspects of international climate or development policy, that we feel that there is no place for local voices, for indigenous voices, for women's voices. But even as I say this, we can hear the lie in it. This is a place which needs more, not less input from the people experiencing climate change firsthand and finding solutions on a daily basis. The commitments parties have made through Agenda 2030 and the Paris Climate Agreement to deliver increasingly ambitious climate action can only raise the importance of procedural rights in the context of climate decision-making. Given the range of processes under Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement, and the diffuse set of actors now involved, it's evident that limited ad hoc public engagement or sporadic consultations are not fit for purpose. This is particularly true in the climate sphere, where a robust commitment to public participation in decision-making is urgently needed at all levels in order to ensure human rights protections are integrated into climate processes and interventions, so the states are held to account for progress on their Paris commitments. Let me focus for a minute on women's participation. A 2030 study by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights finds, and I quote, "Women continue to face significant discrimination in relation to their participation in public and political life in all geographical regions. And the reasons for this are multifaceted and complex and include economic, social and cultural issues, structural and social barriers, and deeply entrenched gender roles and stereotypes. Improving women's participation has been something my foundation has been working on for a number of years now. And while progress has been made in gender equality and the Gender Action Plan in the climate regime, it has lagged behind other areas. A good friend of mine, Agnes Lena, who's an advocate for human rights and gender equality, is a pastoralist from Samburu County in northern Kenya. She told me of what can go wrong when local and indigenous communities aren't consulted in the design and implementation of climate solutions, when we were together recently at a COP, a conference on climate. Her community was not consulted before the construction of the Lake Turkana wind farm, made up of over 365 wind turbines covering approximately 40,000 hectares. It's the biggest wind farm in Africa, with a lot of World Bank and Danish and other money. But the pastoralists whose land this was being built over weren't consulted. It wasn't considered that pastoralists had any rights, land rights or rights to be consulted. And they won't benefit, as it stands, from access to the renewable energy, which would be channeled elsewhere to the cities. And as a result of the lack of transparency, communication and participation, there have been protests by local communities, and an injunction was issued over the construction of the last 6 turbines. Using tools like environmental impact assessment and legal protections such as free, fair and prior and informed consent and procedural rights, Agnes's community is demanding their rights. They're not against wind energy or development, but they do want their rights to be respected and their knowledge to inform decision making, and they would like to benefit from this enormous wind turbine project. Agnes personifies the value of empowering women to be leaders in their community and the powerful impact women like her can have when they engage in climate decision-making at national and international level. Armed with this story of hers and empowered through access to education, access to information and access to resources, she was able to speak truth to power at the international level and to demand respect for the rights of her community and communities like hers. As she's often said, there should be nothing about us without us. Increasing women's participation in the design, planning and implementation of climate actions can lead to improved environmental and development outcomes for everyone, and women's leadership and inclusion at all levels has led to improved outcomes at climate-related projects and policies. The benefits of this participation are not just for women, the whole community benefits. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. However, we must ensure meaningful participation at all levels. Too often, we can allow ourselves to be lulled into a false sense of success when we count numbers alone. That, there are at least 10 women out of the 40 people present, that kind of number counting. Gender parity is important, but the barriers don't disappear once women reach the decision-making table. This can be particularly true at grassroots level, where women's participation can be tokenistic or where they can be allocated gender stereotypal roles as organisers. To address this requires us to examine and understand the barriers to women's participation. These reasons are complex and multifaceted. However, we know that taking the time to understand the context in relation to women's ability to participate has real payoffs and can lead to meaningful changes in women's empowerment. Targeted capacity building is central to women's empowerment, to women's participation in decision-making processes. The necessary resources, knowledge, training and supportive environment should be provided. I know that you are planning to have some interesting evening of songs of peace and struggle and protest and planned for later today, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you. I'm flying off to Geneva later today to launch a Centre for Sports and Human Rights, a different thing, but also has its own importance. But I do love a good song, and I like dancing as well. And I wanted to finish by sharing a memory that I have, a special memory that really surprised me, as the choir surprised me this morning. It was when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I was in Delhi, and I just had time and the opportunity to visit a small project in a slum area of Delhi on the river. And there was a small NGO showing me their projects. And they were similar to many of the activities that you as community development experts are engaged in. And while I was there, the woman who was heading the NGO asked me if I'd mind if the children of the community sang a song for me. And of course, I said I was delighted. And I hadn't noticed, but just outside in a narrow alleyway, there were 80 children beautifully dressed in white. And they rose to their feet and they sang in Hindi, "We shall overcome." And it was one of the most moving experiences. And, we shall overcome. Come on, choir, little song, we shall overcome. Come on, I can't sing, but come on. Come on, come on, come on. We shall overcome someday. Eh?